My name is Amy Morris. Welcome to the Festival of Books, the teen and tween audio interviews here at the University of Arizona. Today we have Marie Lou interviewing the Tanque Verde, or being interviewed by the Tanque Verde High School.
Okay, well, hi and good afternoon. So my name is Sarah. I'm a sophomore, like she said, at Tanque Verde, and thank you for taking the time for talking with us today.
Of course, yeah.
So we're just gonna jump into the questions right away. Janae?
So hi, I'm Janae, and I'm a sophomore. So your first question is, who inspired you to pursue a career in writing? Can you share how you became a writer?
Yeah, sure, and thank you for your questions and for doing this interview with me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys, since this is like my first live event in a bit, so so it's nice to chat with you guys. What inspired me to become a writer? I had always loved writing since I was small, but I didn't know that it was a job that you could do. I don't know where I thought books came from. You know, I just assumed that they're like here in the library and they've got like brand names on them, and it just never occurred to me that they were written by real people until I was 13. But until then, I had been writing a lot of my own stories, and just because I love doing it, so I would staple together books for myself and doodle in them and write my name on them and that kind of thing. But when I was 13, I read this article in the paper about a girl named Amelia Atwater Rhodes, who had gotten her first book deal with Simon & Schuster, and she was 13 years old. And I remember reading that and thinking, first of all, like, oh, real people write books. And also, she's 13 and I'm 13. Oh my God, does that mean that I can publish a book? And then I realized, like, oh, being a writer is a profession. Like, people can actually do this for a living. And at that moment, I was like, oh, this is what I want to do with my life. Like, I would love to be a writer. I would love to be a published author. So that was where I started writing. And, I didn't know a lot of people who were interested in writing. I had one friend who was also interested, so we talked a lot about writing and would share our work and stuff, and I would go to the library and check out books on like how do you submit a book, like how do you get an agent, that kind of thing. So it took me a long time to get to the point where I could actually publish a book, but that was where it began. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalie and I'm a sophomore as well. As a female writer of color, what challenges have you faced in the writing industry?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Natalie. That's a really interesting question. Legend was published in 2011, and it was a very different publishing atmosphere at the time. If you look at the New York Times list back then, it was a completely white list, and I, grew up reading and writing fantasy and sci-fi, and never saw myself or really any people of color in those stories. It just wasn't a thing in fantasy and sci-fi at the time. To the point where, so when I first started writing my own stories as a teen, it never occurred to me to put myself in my stories. It just it didn't even bother me because I was so far removed from that. I had never seen that, and I just assumed like, oh, this is the way it is in these worlds. Like this is how they're done. And so I didn't read a book featuring an Asian protagonist in a fantasy until I was an adult. It was the Nippon Silver Phoenix, and that was like 2008 or something like that. So when I started writing Legend, I had a bit of an identity crisis. And I remember thinking, I can either write myself into my stories and be authentic and take my career and end up in like Asian American studies or wherever they put books by people of color, or I can erase myself from my books and have a career. And those were my two options. And at the time, it was a very real fear. And I remember crying about it and being like, I don't know which one of these paths I want to take. And was really, really scared to write a character like Day. And if you read Legend, you can kind of tell that I was scared. And it's a little bit like, Day is a character and all these amazing things. Also, he's Asian, but you kind of like skip over. So I was really scared to put myself into the story. And I think that the industry has changed a lot. And as it's changed, I have gotten braver with each book and bolder about putting in what I feel is authentic and real to the world and feeling like I can be safe in doing that. So I think it's a testament that things are moving in the right direction. that I can feel like I can write an Asian lead and not feel like it will threaten my career now. I think that the industry still has a long way to go, but I am grateful that it is heading in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so my name's Steph, and I'm also a sophomore. So my question is, what is the writing process you use to develop your creative ideas? And is there a specific routine you follow, or is it more organic?
That's a great question. Thank you, Tess. I don't know if I have like a specific process for coming up with an idea. I think it's a little bit of magic. It kind of depends on what's in my head at the moment. It's funny because when I go back through the books that I've come out with, I can see who I was as a person in that snapshot in time. It's like every book very much feels like a snapshot of who I was in that moment and what mattered to me and what was keeping me up at night and what was bothering me about the world and what I needed to figure out. So I think part of the process is a little bit like journaling. It's understanding or trying to figure out who I am in that moment, and that's usually for me almost subconsciously where I begin finding the idea for a new story. For example, Legend was in 2009. That's when I first started writing it. And Obama had just been elected, and so there was this air of kind of excitement in the country, but also this unease. Like I don't know if you guys remember. I know you guys were really young at the time, but that was the first time you could see like the Republican Party fracturing, and that was the year Gabby Giffords got shot. There like a lot of weird things were happening, and so I felt very like excited but unsettled, where I was like, I don't understand, what's happening right now, but something is happening. And so from that, I started creating the world of Legend, where I was like, what if we just push these two, ideologies like to the extreme, and I just made and I split America down the middle, like physically, and drew a geographic wall dividing the country, and flooded the whole place. I did all kinds of horrible stuff. And that was the genesis for Legend. And looking back now, I can be like, oh, this is why I wrote that in. This is why it was bothering me. Same story with Warcross. Warcross was right when virtual reality and augmented reality were taking off, and it was really exciting to see, but kind of unsettling. And so that's what was keeping me up at night, and so that became a story. And I also used to work in video games, so all of that went into it. Skyhunter was my post-2016 series, so it's very obvious in that whole series, like, oh, she definitely wrote this post-2016, and all of my thoughts, since that election on for those years. So it's very much like it's my way of figuring out both my place in the world and what I have to say about it in that moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Bella and I'm a junior. So how do you find inspiration for your characters in books? Like, is there a place you like to go for ideas, or does your cultural background inspire your writing at all?
Oh, that's a great question, Tess. I think for my characters, it's a little bit like finding my creative ideas, but I think for characters, I like to observe people in real life and then kind of, not that I put whole people into my books, real people, without their permission. But I like to take bits and pieces of traits that I find interesting about people and combine them into a character. And the other thing that I really like to do when it comes to characters is I think that all characters have to exist in groups. I think that's what makes a character really shine, is their interactions with other characters. Like, you can't really understand a character in isolation. You kind of want to see their interactions with somebody else, and that's where the magic happens, that's where the sparks happen. So when I come up with characters, I tend to come up with them in clusters of like 2 or 3. So with Legend, I've always loved the trope of, like the Robin Hood, the thief with a heart of gold, the Han Solo type of character. So I always knew that Day was a character that I wanted to write about, but he needed a foil. I needed somebody, for him to bounce off of, to clash against. And so Day and June kind of were created at the same time. I needed like both of them for their characters to work. Like, neither of them really work without the other. So from there, I started asking myself questions about like, who are the people that Day trusts in his life? Who are the people that June trusts in her life? And how do those people know each other? Like, how do they clash? And if they clash, what happened to Day and June? So that's how the cast gets built out. It's kind of it's an organic process as well. With my latest series, Skyhunter, that story is about a Goman Talon who is an elite warrior defending the world's last free nation against the Federation. And she's a very like stoic, very quiet, very like introspective character. And I needed her to have a crew around her that could balance that. So Talon was created at the same time as her found family. She has like a crew of fellow warriors with whom she is very close with whom she like, they're like her ride or die, group. And all of their personalities are, they came about based on the other characters' personalities. I was looking for a good balance that would work with everybody. So my characters come out that way. They come in clusters. They come in terms of balancing other characters, and I think I very rarely create just a single character on their own. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Melanie,
Hi.
and I'm a junior. So in preparation for the interview, we read The Kingdom of Back. So it was one of your first novels you wrote, but you published it in why did you publish it in 2020 and not earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question, Melanie. And I love that you guys knew that it was one of my first books that I wrote, because that was the book that I wrote before Legend, and submitted it. And the thing is, at the time, it was 2007 or 2008 or something like that, and I didn't really know a lot about YA. I actually didn't understand it as a category yet. I hadn't read any YA. So when I gave it to my agent, we were submitting it as adult historical fantasy, and at the time, historical fiction was not selling at all. And it was mostly a marketing question. I think that was the first time that I had encountered that, and my agent sent it to everybody, and nobody wanted to buy it because half the people who we submitted to thought that it was YA, the other half thought that it was adults, and so it just fell into this weird, nobody knew what to do with it. It's a quiet story about Mozart, so it never really took root anywhere. So we had to shelve it, and as it was being rejected by everybody, I was writing Legend. And then Legend sold, and I kind of, put The Kingdom of Back on the side for a while I was working on my other series. But The Kingdom of Back was always in the back of, pun intended, back of my head. I just kept thinking about it, and Kristen, my agent, was like, at some point we should think about trying to bring this out again when the market improves for historicals. And then Hamilton happened, in 2016, I think, or 2015, and suddenly historicals were super trendy and in again. So we dusted off The Kingdom of Back, and I edited it and polished it back up, and we did some big changes on it and submitted it again to my current editor at the time. And so this time around, I had the advantage of at least I had some books under my belt, and historical was in. So because of that, that's why it came out, much later in 2020. So sometimes this is very much a matter of market and timing for a book. A lot of things are out of our control, but I am grateful that it finally got its legs and was able to get out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, back to me. So in your acknowledgement for The Kingdom of Back, you shared that you started writing this book when you were still trying to find your voice. Can you elaborate on that? And is this shown through your main character, Nano?
That's a great question. At the time, I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. I wanted to write fantasy and sci-fi. I think I was a little afraid to write it because of the fact that I didn't know if I could write myself into it, and then I thought if I couldn't write authentic versions of the world that I wanted to write, what was the point of writing it? So in that angst, I was writing The Kingdom of Back, which is a little bit simpler to figure out in that regard because it's about real people who lived, as opposed to a fantasy world that I was creating. So in that way, I was figuring out my voice at the time and what kind of writer I wanted to be and what categories I wanted to be in. And I think that, Nano's story is so compelling to me because I think that she never got a chance to think about stuff like that, I think that I put a lot of my frustrations with wanting to get published and wanting to share my work with people into Nannerl, because I imagine that that may be what she had felt at the time. Because, Nannerl was a young woman in 18th century Europe, and you were literally not allowed to be a composer as a young woman back then. It was unthinkable. At the time, it was considered inappropriate for a young woman to make money doing something that was entertainment related. It was considered beneath you and also, just inappropriate. So, which is a bunch of BS, but that's the way that it was in Europe at the time. So she never had that option to even attempt to get her work noticed or publish it or be like her brother and tour and play in front of people and compose music and have it published. And so I put myself in her shoes, and I just cannot imagine what that must have felt like as a creative person to be barred from being creative just because you were a woman. So I think in that way she very much reflected my frame of mind and in my need to want to get my work out there, and knowing that she had a zero chance, of getting her work out there. So I think in that way she is a reflection, and that book is a reflection of who I was as a person during that time as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you briefly touched on this in the last question, but you've written and published several dystopian novels before this. What drew you to writing Back to You, a Drama?
What drew me to writing dystopian? I think that dystopian is, and sci-fi in general, and fantasy, are a really interesting way of pointing a finger at something that is wrong with society and just magnifying it. And you just blow it up, and you can really pick apart something. You can exaggerate it to the extreme, and it helps me figure things out. So that's what I like about dystopian, in terms of analyzing something that's bothering me with reality. The other thing I like about dystopian is that you can destroy a world, but in this version, you are God. You can do anything. I can't control everything that's happening in the real world, but I can control everything that's happening in this world. And that feels good. I like being able to give certain characters power and take power away from other characters and give them the ending that I want to give them. That kind of thing, that is very cathartic to me, especially when things in the real world feel out of my control. I can be like, okay, I can replicate this in my fiction, and I can make sure that, the people who deserve terrible things can get the terrible things, and people who deserve good things get the good things. And in that way, it's almost like my escape, from reality. So that's what I like about it.
Thank you.
So, out of all the influential and famous composers and musicians throughout history, why did you choose to write about the Mozart?
It's a great question. I loved Mozart when I was a kid. I played piano from the age of 8 onward, and always found Mozart's music really beautiful and deceptively simple. It sounds simple, but it's actually incredibly hard to master. And I always kind of hated him for that, because I hated playing his music so much, but I also I don't know how you do this. So I loved reading about him, and I loved the movie Amadeus. I just liked Mozart. I think I probably had a little crush on Mozart. And then when I was in college, I read a biography about Mozart, and in one of the chapters, they talked about his sister. And I was like, nobody told me he had a sister. Why has that never been mentioned anywhere in history? She was never in Amadeus, not even a breath of her, And in this book, she was really only in one chapter in the beginning of the book. And I was like, what? And the crazy thing is, she's 5 years older than Mozart, every bit as talented as him. Apparently, she had been the inspiration for him to learn piano, and he absolutely worshipped her. He idolized her. There are thousands of letters that he wrote to Nannerl through his lifetime, where he would constantly gush about her work. Send me your latest composition. I love your work so much. Oh my God, you're so talented. I wish I could write like you. And I'm like, none of her music has survived in history. None of it. And that just blew my mind. I was just like, I cannot believe that this girl existed and nobody knew. And she was so talented. And she was like the other Mozart. But, what happened? What happened? Why don't we talk about her? And so I became a little bit obsessed with reading about her. And as I was reading about her, there was this really interesting little historical fact in one of the things I read, and it was about how when they were children, they toured together and they created this magical kingdom of Back. Like, that was a historical fact that they had done that, and they did that to pass the time in the carriage. And I was just like, this is such a magical little historical fact, and I felt like I had to write something about it. So there was just so many interesting things about their dynamic as siblings. Their father, who was a complete stage dad overlord, who like pushed them, and I always felt kind of sorry for Wolfgang too, because he had been born into this, he loved what he did, but he was also a child, and he was kind of the family breadwinner and dragged around Europe when he was like 6 years old to play for everyone so that their family could make money. And loved his sister so much, and he was like the only one in the family, I think, who really encouraged her to write. But he's like, I just want to see what you created. So there's a lot of rumors now that maybe some of her music may have survived under his name, especially when he was younger. There's evidence of several different handwritings in some of the earliest works of his, and they've narrowed it down to like 3 different handwritings. There's like his father's, of course, which we all knew about, and then his, and then there's like a 3rd handwriting. And so some people speculate that some of that survived is his sister's work. So we may never know, if that is some of it, but I think it's quite possible that was the case, especially when Mozart was publishing music when he was like 5 years old. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he had a little bit of help. I mean, he was a genius, but, there's another genius in the family that he could have drawn from. So anyway, I just thought their whole story was fascinating and interesting, and that's why I wanted to write a story about them. Yeah.
Okay, so continuing with the Mozart timeline. So how did you use your knowledge and research on them to write about the relationship with one another?
Yeah, this was my first time writing about real people. And this is like, I've always gotten to, make up people and knew everything. I knew that they who they were in my head. And this is the first time I was like, oh, I don't actually know everything about you guys. And I felt this sudden pressure to not just stay true to who they were, but to be able to create a fictional version of them that still felt respectful of who they were in real life. So I read a lot of their letters that they wrote to each other, read a lot of Mozart biographies, and just tried to piece together what little I could about Nano, because there's not a lot about her. Most of the feeling of her that I got was from Mozart, from Wolfgang's letters to her. And they were super, super close. Wolfgang was a very affectionate boy. Like, he was one of those boys who just wore his heart on his sleeve. Like, if he liked you, he loved you, and he wouldn't stop telling you. He would write things like 1,000 kisses to you, my sister, I miss you, oh my God, I miss you so much, I'm on the road, I stick by you all the time. Like, he would say that about his mother, he was just all heart. Like, that was just who he was as a person. And Nano was very, very, like, patient and tender with his little brother, and I just loved that relationship so much. And a lot of the inspiration for their conflicts and for their, their friendlier moments in the book came from their interactions that I saw, through their letters. Yeah.
So, historically, women, especially women of color, have been overlooked in comparison to male counterparts. This seems to have influenced how you told the story, and do you think you could elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, I always knew that was the tangent that the story needed to take. I wanted it to be about Wolfgang, but mostly it was Nano's story. And I think that a lot of the things that I wanted to put in were her frustration. And I wanted to write about her in a way that felt realistic for the time. I didn't want it to feel anachronistic. Like, she's clearly not going to be a feminist who's just like standing there like, freedom for women, I deserve to be composed. Like, she couldn't have had that thought at the time. She was raised in a very, very different world than we get to have now. So I tried to think about it from the point of view of somebody who grew up never knowing that you could be this. Like, she was in a very specific box, and for that I drew a lot on, we were talking earlier about when I was growing up and never seeing people of color, let alone women of color, as protagonists in fantasy novels. Like, when you don't see it at all, it doesn't occur to you that things can be different, you know? And you just kind of accept that this is the way the world is. And I tried to draw on that for the Kingdom of Back and try to imagine Nannerl's point of view as being somebody who is like, oh, this is a woman's place in this world, and this is my place. But also, I have this like strange, you know, intense passion for music in my heart, and I don't know how to align those two things. You know, I imagine that maybe that's who she was. Like she knew what she had to do when she grew up and became a woman. She's seen her mother, but she's also like, I love composition. Like I love music, and I don't know where to put that passion. Like what do I do with it? So I think the story was really about that frustration in her and how she tries to figure that out for herself.
Oh, sorry. So what was the hardest part about writing The Kingdom of Back?
The hardest part was the research. I have never done historical fiction before, and it is a whole other level of research compared to my usual. It's usually when I'm writing fantasy and stuff, I think to be like, well, you know, what did people eat at the time? I'll just make it up, you know, it's fine. And suddenly I was like, what did people eat in 18th century Austria? I don't know. I had to go hunting for like books about that time period and what Austria was like, and how long did it take for you to be in the carriage, and what were carriages made out of, and you know, how did people get their meat? How did people get their dresses made? Like, if you go to a dressmaker, how many people does it take to make a dress? There were so many like questions that I didn't know the answers to, and the level of research was just a whole other level than what I was used to, you know. So I had done research before for like the Young Elites, which is the fantasy version of Renaissance Italy, but you know, you can kind of, it's a made up world, so you can kind of focus. But this one was just like, oh my God, you know, what if there are carriages going along the Seine River? Where does it go? Does it go through the woods? Is it in the hills? So what else was happening in the world in 1770, whatever? So it was a lot of research. It was fun research, but I think that's why this book took like 10 years to come out.
So my next question is, how did you go about creating the character of Hyacinth?
Hyacinth. I'm glad you asked about him. Hyacinth was, you know, the one thing in the story that I got to make up completely, and I loved creating Hyacinth. I wanted him to be a little bit like he's a representation of the darker part of Nannerl's heart, and also a little bit of the devil and a little bit of a tempter, and just an imp. You know, he is the tempter in the story, and so I love building him as a character. I wanted him to feel like somebody who is dangerous but also very compelling, that you're like, I don't think I should trust you, but you seem kind of cool. So I like playing with Hyacinth a lot. He changed a lot from the many versions that I've had of this book. And early on, he was very much like a little gremlin. He was like 2 feet tall and just like you know, with more of like a goblin, like in the German tale type of story. And then as the versions went on, he became a more Peter Pan type character than I meant him to be, and a little bit of like the world of Back was a little bit of like Wonderland, kind of upside down, very whimsical, very dark place. So it was really fun playing with him because he was the one part of the story where I could just be free and make whatever I wanted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did you use the actual map of the Kingdom of Back that the Mozart siblings created to develop the upside down world?
Yeah, great question. I don't think there's actually a surviving copy of what the Kingdom of Back looked like from their point of view. So that was all made up for me. You know, I looked around and I couldn't find any evidence of what it actually looked like what they drew out. Because they did draw it out. Like they had a servant named Sebastian who traveled with them, and apparently at one point, like Sebastian was helping them draw out their map. But I don't know what it had. All I know is that in their version of the Kingdom of Back, people talked backwards and people walked backwards, and everything was backwards in their version of the Kingdom of Back. So that inspired the upside down trees in my version of the Kingdom of Back. I didn't make everything backwards, but but that was the original inspiration for it.
What was the most interesting part about Austrian culture that you learned while doing the whole research and stuff?
Oh, wow. Now I'm thinking back to what I've learned and forgotten. Well, I know that a lot of they had like a meat market that happened along the river that ran near their house. So when they went shopping, they would go down and they would walk this river, and then you would just see like people both doing laundry and also killing livestock and selling meat there. It's always a good combination. And yeah, that was really interesting. There were a lot of Austrian folk tales that I thought were interesting. I did buy this copy of like Austrian folk tales. That was a translation of a little collection that someone had released some time ago, and it was just interesting and weird to read about. Like they had one about like a goblin gremlin character who lived under a mountain near Salzburg, and there was another one about the stars and how they're connected to like these little white flowers that grew on the hillside, which ended up making it into the story. So that was really interesting to read about. Yeah, those were the two pieces I think of history that I remember the most clearly. Yeah.
Okay. So were any of your characters in this novel or in any other books you've written inspired by people in your life?
Inspired by people in my life. Yes. I think almost all the characters are inspired in some way by somebody in their life, but I don't think there's any character that is a whole, like, I took the person and put him in the book. Actually, no, I take that back. There's in Batman Nightwalker, which is my Batman book, my best friend is in that book. So my friend Diane Garcia is Bruce's BFF. And that's because she's a huge Batman nerd. Like and just like a nerd in general, she knows everything there is to know about anything like nerd culture related. She's very, very cool. She's a cool version of me. And so when I wrote Batman, I was like, you have to be in this book. And so I made her, with her blessing, I made her Bruce's BFF, and she's the one who like checks Bruce, and she'd make sure that he doesn't go out of line, and he knows his privilege, and all of that. So she was really fun to put in the story. Yeah.
Okay, 18. So immortality and legacy are big themes in the Kingdom of Back. So what really inspired you to write about those two topics?
Yeah, immortality and legacy. You're supposed to talk the questions. So my favorite thing out of Hamilton is that moment where I forget who says it now, where he's like, why do you write like you're running out of time? And I always think about that as a creative person, because it feels like that very much for me, where I'm just like, why? Like, there's all these things that you want to get out, and you don't know if you have the time, but you want to leave it behind somehow. And so I felt like I feel like for other creative people, I constantly hear some version of that, where, sometimes people ask me, like, do you ever struggle with having enough ideas, or do you ever run out of ideas? I'm like, no, the problem is there's too many ideas, and I don't know how to get them all out, but I feel like I've got to get it all out. And I feel like maybe that's how it was for Nano, and for Wolfgang too. And I think Wolfgang, I don't know about Nano, but Wolfgang wrote like a fiend. He had like 400, pieces published by the time he died. He was only 36 when he died, but he wrote like crazy. And he wrote when he was feverish. He wrote when he was dying. Like he had all this in his head that he needed to get out. So I feel like I wanted to explore this idea of like, why do we have that? What is it that compels creative people to need? It feels like this need to get this stuff out of your head. Is it to leave something behind? Is it to share with other people? Like, is it for your own like mental clarity? Like, what is it? So I find that a compelling thing that I think about all the time, and it felt like the right book to talk about. Like, what are you leaving behind when you're gone? What do you want other people to take from your life? Like, what was it that was worth it? So yeah, I think that's why those went into that book.
So this kind of relates to what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
What legacy do you hope to leave behind as a writer and as a human being?
Gosh, good question. Wow. You know, at the end of the day, I just hope that I was able to create something that entertains people. I think that really is all I can hope for as a novelist. I just want to write something that makes people happy for a couple of hours. And sometimes I don't know if I'm doing enough, if that's really a legacy or anything. It's just what makes me happy. Like, I feel really happy when I can make something that makes someone happy, you know? And I guess that's what drives me to write. I just really, really like sharing that with people. And I hope that's enough of a legacy. I don't know. That's my ultimate goal for my writing. Any other questions?
I have one question that came up kind of earlier.
Yeah.
So, you were talking about when you were younger and stuff, and you wrote a lot. Did you ever kind of find a hitch in that, where either you were too busy to write, or you just couldn't write at times? Like, how did you deal with that? How did you overcome it?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I did go through a period where I stopped writing. I was trying so hard to get published, and when I was 14, I wrote my first horrible novel. I thought it was great. It was not on the Lord of the Rings. I hope none of you ever see it. And I submitted to agents, and nobody wanted to see it, of course, because it was terrible. And then I wrote a second novel when I was 16 or 17, and that one got me an agent, but he shopped it around to every publisher you could think of, and everybody rejected it. It just wasn't good. Like, I look back and it just wasn't quite there yet. And then I went off to college and I wrote a third novel. And at this point, you know, my parents knew that I was interested in writing. What I would do in high school is I would set my alarm for 2 in the morning, and I would write for like 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then just be a very sleepy person through high school. I don't recommend doing this, but that's how I got my writing done at the time. And my parents were just like, okay, I think this is getting a little intense. So they just kind of sat me down. They were like, you know, look, we know you really like writing, but know that this is not really a stable career choice, and we would like it if you would make sure that you still concentrate on doing something that's stable, and that's like a real job in the future. And I knew it was coming from a good place, because, you know, my parents are immigrant parents, and like they want to make sure that you're not like living under a bridge. Like, they want to make sure that you're going to be okay, and I understood that, and I know that, you know, for them, they never had the option of like choosing what they wanted to do for a job, or they had to put food on the table, and they had a kid. And so for me, it was a privilege to think about, oh, what do I actually want to do with my life, you know, that I enjoy. Like, that is a true privilege to be able to do that. So I understood where that was coming from, and so I went out to college and I studied like biology and social sciences. I thought I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer, which are great professions, but like, as I was studying, I realized neither one of those jobs was for me, and so I kept writing on the side. I wrote a third novel, and my agent hated it, so he dropped me as a client. And so at that point, I had accumulated probably 500 or 600 rejection letters, and my agent had dropped me, and I didn't have a book that I could submit. So I felt like I had gone in this giant circle, and I just been turning my wheels in the mud, and like nothing was getting anywhere. So I felt like I was right back at square one. And that discouraged me so much, and I had this moment where I was like, you know, maybe I'm just not the person to do this, and maybe it's not in the cards for me, and maybe I just need to like grow up. Like, I thought that this was like, you know, writing fantasy novels, maybe that's just not something that grown-ups do. I don't know what I thought grown-ups did, but I thought maybe I was being childish, and that I needed to like put that aside. So I put it aside. I stopped, and I think I was just really, my creative well had run dry, and I just felt really down with the whole thing, and I just stopped writing for like 2 or 3 years. I didn't write a single thing for 2 or 3 years. I kept reading, and I kept drawing, and I kept like playing video games and doing other like creative things, but I didn't write again until I graduated. I think that as a writer, like, you eventually get that itch back. You just can't, you know, I said that writing was like my way of figuring out the world with myself, and I realized in time that it is a part of who I am as a person, and at some point, you know, I was able to get that back, and I noticed I started like figuring out stories again and thinking about, you know, writing chapters and that kind of thing. So it did eventually come back, but it took me a sec to get there. I definitely went through a period where I was just like the weight of the rejection kind of got to me. But you build up a thick skin eventually, and I wrote The Kingdom of Back, and that got rejected all over again. But by then once you've seen like 600 rejections, they do stop mattering at some point. You're like, whatever, just another one, put it on file. So you build up a skin, and then eventually, then one day suddenly, Leslie's sold. So, yeah, it was a long journey, but I definitely had my ups and downs. Yeah.
So this kind of relates to what we're talking about. So you said you had a lot of rejection. So what would you tell young writers or people trying to get things published? Like, what would your be advice to them, especially with rejections and the process?
Yeah, the process is rough. For most people, it's rough. Every now and then there's somebody who's like, I got it on my first try. I'm like, that's great. For most people, it's rough. I would say, as an aspiring writer, I think the thing that I would have really loved to have known ahead of time is, first of all, don't be afraid to write something that's bad. When I first started writing, I was obsessed with trying to get it down perfect on the first try. And so this beautiful vision in my head that I had of a book never came out on the page. And so I would write like 3 chapters, and I would think like, oh, this isn't, what I was trying to do. And I would try to edit it and edit it and edit it. And then I would get tired of it, and then some other shiny idea would come along, and I would switch gears and do that. So I had all these like 3-chapter stories that went nowhere. And then eventually I realized you just have to finish something. It doesn't matter if it's good, it's probably bad, it's fine. It's still bad. My first chapter's still terrible, but you have to have something to work with, right? So my biggest writing advice is quantity over quality. Just get the word count down. It does not matter what it is, just get it down. Once you have something to work with, you can rip it apart, you can take chapters out, you can put things in, you can do whatever you want with it. The other thing that's specifically related to rejection is, I would say, a rejection of your book is not a rejection of you as a person. And I think that's a really, really difficult thing for creative people to come to terms with, because you put a little bit of yourself into your work. So in a way, it is you. Your heart is in this book. So when you get rejected for it, it can very much feel like people are saying that you as a person are not good enough, and that can be really, really crushing to a person. And I think for aspiring writers, I just want to comfort them to say, it's not saying that you as a person are not good enough. You as a person are wonderful. Don't change who you are. This is not a rejection of you. It is just a rejection of this piece of work. At the end of the day, it really is just a book. It is just a book. It's not you as a person. I still find myself struggling with that, struggling with this idea of this is a commercial product, but this is also a piece of my heart, And how do you separate those two things? And how do you think about your work as both something that is technically commercial that you sell for a living, and also this creative piece of yourself, that is kind of squishy and delicate and can be crushed, by people. So I hope that aspiring writers can keep that in mind when inevitably you get a rejection, that these are two separate things, and that it doesn't mean anything about who you are as a person.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I mean, I have more of a fun question, not really for writing. Do you have a comfort snack when you're writing?
I love flaming hot Cheetos. The trick is you gotta use chopsticks to eat them, because then you don't get the dust all over your fingers.
Mm-hmm. My mom uses a spoon, so.
Also does, yeah.
Question for you. Do you have a playlist that goes with your books?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard that from some other authors where they have a playlist that goes with their book.
Yeah, I always do. Yeah, and I probably spend way too much time reading them. I should be writing. Yeah. When I'm drafting, I'll usually I have a separate playlist for when I'm drafting, because I can't listen to stuff lyrics. It just throws me. So I have a lot of game soundtracks and movie soundtracks, and like trailer music houses will make all these like cool, you know, like 2-minute compilations of music. So I have a lot of that on my playlist. And then I have like playlists for when I'm more like the editing, copy editing phase, when I can listen to stuff with lyrics, and then I pick out songs that I think match, you know, the tone and mood and lyrics of that book, you know. And I also sometimes will create like playlists by emotion. So I'll have like the happy playlist. Actually, I don't have a happy playlist. like a sad playlist or like a war playlist or like the, you know, like when I'm writing a love scene playlist, when I'm writing like a sad scene playlist, like I'll have that. So I'm trying to get like into the emotional state of that scene. I will have that. Yeah.
Is it on Spotify, like with your?
Oh no! Sometimes I share. I actually don't have a Spotify. I sometimes I'll share it on my Instagram and stuff. Yeah. Hi.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So thank you for coming to the festival this year and for participating with the audio interviews. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you guys for your amazing and thoughtful and wonderful questions. That was awesome. I had so much fun.
Thank you. Yeah, loved it.
Yeah, that was so fun. Yeah, thank you guys.